Picture, camera, set up like Big Brother.
Okay.
But it's Snow White in her house with all the dwarves, but also a tiny home experience. Like, MTV, welcome to my tiny home. I live in the tiny home with all these dwarves.
With 8 people.
One tall woman, bunch of tiny men. How does it work?
My dream.
Welcome back to the Wouldn't You Like to Know podcast. I'm your host, Asha.
And I'm Kat. When I say fairy tale, what do you think? What comes to mind right off the bat?
First thing that comes to mind is probably either Jack and the Beanstalk or Red Riding Hood.
Yeah?
Very classic fairy tales.
And like in a book way, or like how did that get introduced to you?
I think Jack and the Beanstalk got introduced to me as a kid when I was reading it in like the children's picture book. I think the photos and the images and the illustrations of Jack and the Beanstalk was super transformative to me, especially as an artist.
Have you ever done any art for Jack and the Beanstalk?
Never.
Okay.
Maybe I should.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be coming soon.
Sounds like it's a prompt for me now.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, Little Red Riding Hood, I feel like is like the most obvious one for me too, because I am a redhead, so my friends growing up would call me Little Red, and then through there, obviously, like you know about the story, and I'm pretty sure that like a lot of cartoons have made Little Red Riding Hood episodes, so you know the whole animation of the wolf dressing up as the grandma, and then also that's in Shrek.
Yeah.
So you know that. So I feel like I have like a lot of imagery and then with Little Red Riding Hood, and then also I, of course, dressed up as Little Red Riding Hood probably 5 times so far. I have 2 costumes on the ready at all times.
That's perfect.
Yeah,
That's
always.
a perfect idea.
But then also, one of my favorite movies growing up was Ella Enchanted.
That's a good one.
Yeah, so I feel like that one, it's like a fun musical take. And like kind of funny, goofy musical take on Cinderella. So that's one of my favorite movies for sure.
That's super cool. What do you think then are your earliest memories of a fairy tale? Like, did you read books as a kid? Were you read books like as a kid from your parents? Movies?
I feel like I remember this really old kind of brown paper book that was like really big, and my parents would read me it. Before going to bed. I feel like we had like a lot of old books growing up because our family from England would bring over a lot of cool books like that. So I feel like that's what my first memory is. But for some reason, the wolf from Shrek is like really in my mind right now. That's all I can see.
As one of the biggest like fairy tale icons.
Yeah, and then also the scene from Ella Enchanted when she's singing for all the giants so she doesn't die.
That's also a very classic fairy tale trope, trying to, survive.
Yeah.
What about fairy tale characters? What do you think you identify with the most? I personally think Sleeping Beauty. I'm a sleepy girl. One thing you're going to catch me doing is sleeping always and hoping to be woken up by a prince, What about you?
Just waiting.
Just waiting in bed.
Just waiting. What is that thing that she pricks her finger on?
Oh, the spool, the spinning wheel?
Yeah, the spinning wheel.
Yeah, that's me with my knitting needles right now.
Yeah. I think maybe Snow White was one that I watched a lot, so I feel like maybe...
The one you identified with the most?
Yeah.
Living in a house with a bunch of men?
I think more so the animals.
Right.
I liked the idea of her like singing to the animals and all the animals like coming to her. I remember that we had this one bush in our backyard that a bunch of bees would hang out around, and looking back, there was a beehive in the bush or something, but they were actual proper bumblebees, so they wouldn't hurt me or anything.
They
so
were just collecting pollen and bringing it back to their little house. Did you think you were a bee whisperer?
Yeah. Well,
really
I
cute.
was.
You are a bee whisperer.
Mm-hmm. I would sit on the little stone wall we had, and then I would put out my hand, and then the bees would come, and I named them. So there was like Charlotte and Charlie and George and Georgia.
That's adorable.
Yeah, very southern names for the bees. They're very proper. But yeah, so I think I figured that I was a little bit of a Snow White myself.
That's really cute. I'm trying to think of another character that I would identify with. I mean, there's a new Disney movie that just came out, Wish, and the main character's name is Asha. I guess I identify with her because we have the same name. If you could live in a fairy tale world, which one would you choose and why?
I don't know what one I would live in. I feel like maybe Robin Hood Men in Tights. Is that a fairy tale?
It could be.
Yeah, because I really liked the vibe of that place. It was fun.
Yeah, Robin Hood is a fairy tale itself, and then the adaptation is just another...
Maybe I don't want to live there because he's like constantly in jail. I don't know where I'd want to live. I think like maybe be the Cinderella after she gets the prince. Just live happily ever after there.
Yeah.
And just fuck up my stepsisters. That sounds good. Yeah, well, I'm the queen now,
Exactly.
or the princess, soon to be queen, so then I can kind of, put them into poverty.
Oh.
Right.
Shame.
Yeah. Shame. Yeah. Okay, what about you?
It's not necessarily a fairy tale. I was looking it up if it was based on anything, but the movie Brave, I thought it was based on like origin story of something, but it wasn't. It was, it was like a screenplay written by some woman. But I thought it was so beautiful, and I loved all the animals and like in the woods and in the time when they were shooting bow and arrows and everything. I just think that would be super fun to live in. I'd love to go hand in hand with her for a bow and arrow shootout. I think that'd be pretty fun.
I don't think I've ever actually watched Brave.
Really?
No.
I'm surprised.
I think because when people tell me to do things, I tend to not do them.
I'm surprised you haven't seen it though, because she's a raging redhead.
Mm-hmm. That's rude. But yeah, I think because everybody was like, oh yeah, you look like the girl from Brave. I think I just was like, okay, cool, I'm not going to watch it. Just the same way with Game of Thrones.
Gotcha.
I just look like too many people from Game of Thrones apparently, so I just...
Don't watch it.
No, I just have no interest. I don't know why. I think I'm just stubborn to the core. That type of stuff.
Brave is really cute. Her mom gets turned into a bear, and same with her 3 little siblings, and they turn into bear cubs. Oh. And the whole point of the movie is for her to regain that like love with her mom and come together so she can turn back into a human. It's really adorable. It's like probably one of my favorite Pixar movies. It's really sweet. You have to watch it now. We can watch it together. Okay, well, in speaking about fairy tales, as we have been, do you know the difference between a folklore and a fairy tale?
No. Okay. I don't think I do.
Good. Well, I'm going to explain a little bit of it. So people often use these terms interchangeably, but they're actually super different. Folktale is an oral tradition passed down through generations, while a fairy tale is basically a written version of that same story. Once it's written down, it can be retold exactly the way it was documented. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's folklore is when you're talking about it, and then the fairy tale is when it's written down.
Yeah. Folklore has been talked about, has been like discussed through generations, has changed a little bit. Fairy tale is written down, set in stone. That's what it is.
Cool.
So a folk tale or a folklore is exactly what it sounds like. A story from the folk or the common people of a culture. According to the Merriam-Webster, a folk tale is a characteristically anonymous, timeless, and placeless story passed down orally among a group of people. Folktales can feature both fictional and real-life characters. They're a way of preserving the knowledge, traditions, and values of a particular community passed down through generations by word of mouth. The concept of folk has varied over time, but the term often referred to rural, poor, and illiterate peasants.
Oh.
Yeah.
Good.
I know.
My people.
These groups of people relied on stories told to them by others. Just like you.
Because I can't read.
Exactly. Tales, myths, legends, proverbs, poems, jokes, even songs were all spoken among cultures. As these tales were retold and passed down, essentially like broken telephone, they were changed, regardless of the storyteller's intentions. With no way to really tell the difference between the original from an adapted one, these tales grew and were molded into the stories we know now. Many folklore tell fables ranging from topics about romance, origins of popular holidays, cautionary tales, and stories about animals. Stories about the existence of fairies who dance in specific places when the moon is full, or the Loch Ness Monster, or even dragons and kelpies. Myths and legends have a remarkable ability...
Wait. What? Are you saying that kelpies are like a known thing in folklore?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not just something that was made up by Sarah J. Maas.
No, it wasn't just an ACOTAR thing.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, that's crazy.
Myths and legends have the remarkable ability of often being rooted in specific places, yet their general outlines tend to be actually surprisingly universal. Similar stories happen all over the world, only really varying in specific details. So versions of, let's say, Cinderella can be found in places as far apart as China, India, Britain, North America. It's clear that these stories spread through migration and were then passed down by word of mouth. But why are these stories shared? Why were people discussing them with their children or with their elders? The English Heritage blog says that the explanation may be rooted in general human experience. Maybe these folktales were shared to insist that people keep their promises and avoid making rash decisions, or that courage and perseverance is rewarded, and that evil doesn't always win in the end. Folktales began to be recorded just as soon as humans mastered the technology of writing. Often the very first texts were hymns to the gods, or collections of mythological stories that became organized into cycles, explaining how the world was created, or how humans came into existence, or why death is necessary. Stories in the Bible, the Fall, Noah's flood, for example. And in Greek myth, hero tales are also among the most ancient of story types. Print and writing had quickly made the tradition of folk tales obsolete. Once a story has been frozen in print, it can no longer evolve with telling and retelling, since one reading will be exactly the same as any other, and thus the fairy tale is born. Bum, 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 bum.
So it's like the final boss.
Yeah.
It's like the final chapter of the folklore is it ends when you write it down.
Yeah. It's been changing for centuries, passed down through families, and then all of a sudden, as soon as it's written down, bam, that's whatever way that story was told is how it will be, which is super cool.
Also, like, kind of sad.
Yeah, really
in
sad.
a way. Yeah, like, it's good because it preserves the history of it,
Yeah,
but
of course.
it's also really sad because then you don't get those same evolving stories. Maybe if we let them continue to evolve, maybe they'd be more applicable today.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Who knows? I think there are cases of stories, especially in the First Nations, still being alive today and told through families and generations. But I think more in the European side of things, a lot of fairy tales were written down. This is what I'm going to describe next, is the fairy tale itself. So the Wikipedia definition is fairy tale. Alternative names include fairy tale, fairy story, a household tale, a magic tale, or a wonder tale. Is a short story that belongs to the folklore genre. Such stories typically feature magic, enchantments, and mythical or fanciful beings. So, I guess you could classify ACOTAR and Fourth Wing as a fairy tale.
Would it have to be a folklore first, though, to be a fairy tale?
Well, folklore is inspired fairy tales, so it's redundant.
But, like, would it have to be told orally and, like, passed down to become a fairy tale?
Fairy tales can take aspects of folklore and still be classified as a fairy tale. Dragons, for example, were talked about back then in folklore, and dragons back then were probably, in Europe, and then someone decided to write that down and it became fact or, fiction. And I think that the fact that it was written down based on stories classifies it as a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
In 1695, Charles Perrault, a French author, began collecting and publishing traditional folk tales designed for children. He published Tales and Stories of the Past with Morals, which is subtitled Tales of Mother Goose. These tales became popular in France. Some of his popular stories, like Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, are still commonly told the way Perrault had written them. However, some versions of Sleeping Beauty published today are based partially on a Brothers Grimm tale, Little Briar Rose. He had written Little Red Riding Hood as a warning to readers about strangers preying on young girls walking alone through the forest, cautioning girls about the dangers of trusting men. He states, "Watch out if you haven't learned that tame wolves are the most dangerous of all. I say wolf, for all wolves are not of the same sort. There is one kind with a mendable disposition, neither noisy nor hateful, nor angry but tame, obliging and gentle, following the young maids in the street, even into their homes. Alas, who does not know that these gentle wolves are of such creatures the most dangerous. I love that quote.
That's so scary.
Yeah. Gives me goosebumps a little bit.
Oh, yeah. I got goosebumps.
Yeah. All of Perrault's stories are different in one way or another from the Disney versions and modern retellings. His stories were harsh and violent, but however intense his writings were, he is considered by many to be the founder of the modern fairy tale genre. His desires were to transform stories that he collected into moralistic tales for social good. They were as much warnings for children to behave themselves as anything else. Discipline instilled through fear. Kind of like that saying of children's books or fairy tales for children being more to scare them a little bit.
Well, I feel like that was a pretty popular tactic.
Yeah.
Back in the day, and maybe still now a little bit, but I feel like definitely less. I've heard like of stories, like I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about the lies that our parents tell us when we're younger to scare us from doing something.
Exactly.
But they're telling us that to protect us, and is that little white lie
it's
okay?
the same, I think it's the same kind of premise. What they told us when we were younger is probably the same thing that they were told by their parents. So it's generation after generation. It's a story that's been told and probably changed a little bit based on the time, the culture.
Yeah.
But definitely very, very same. So many kiddos are familiar with classic fairy tales because of Disney's adaptations. The first ever feature-length animated Disney film was Snow White, which was released in 1938. That's a good trivia question. So remember
1938?
that. Snow White was the very first animated Disney
I actually
movie.
did know that.
That's good.
Yeah.
Props for you. Some of the more violent aspects of the story have been edited out since the first time it was printed by the Brothers Grimm. Disney later went on to adapt many more of the fairy tales found in the collection of Perrault and the Brothers Grimm as well. Fairy tales continue to captivate and inspire awe in people of all ages, offering promises of happy endings and glimpses of magic beyond our world. The way folklore has shaped fairy tales and how those tales, in turn, have influenced countless cultures and individuals around the globe is truly remarkable. Storytelling in all its forms is at the heart of so much of the media we consume today. It's fascinating to think about how many of the movies and TV shows we enjoy can trace their roots back to ancient folklore passed down through generations and still resonate with us thousands of years later. So yeah, that's kind of the rundown on folklore turned to fairy tale.
That's crazy.
It's kind of an interesting backstory, isn't it?
It's nice that we can still have that natural change that we might have had if they continued to be folklore and just passed down through oral tradition and just told from family to family. Maybe a family would clean it up a little bit, make it a little bit nicer, and then, maybe add some modern hints. So that's kind of what we've done by having these Disney movies. So it's kind of kept the same essence of the tradition, which is kind of nice.
Do you think that having these Disney movies completely take over the stories, Snow White, Cinderella, completely remake it and make it their own? Do you think that's a good thing? Do you think that's a bad thing?
I think it's really nice that we can have that and have that for the children today and us as children and children for years, because they're considered classics. But I also think it should have been a little bit more widely educated that that's not Disney's story. Because a lot of these stories, when I was looking this up, I had no idea that they were written by a different person, or not even necessarily written by a different person, because that's not what it's about. They were created by entire communities and villages together for a purpose, and I think that that is an incredibly heartwarming thing and makes me feel the sense of community when hearing the story that I wish I had when I first experienced the movie.
Yeah, Disney is such a large corporation, and they really, for lack of a better term, they really came in and bulldozed the idea of, I think, tradition and myth and legend and story. They really came in and put their big Disney logo stamp on these stories and turned them into movies, which I think is fine. I think they went ahead and had their own creativity and artistic license with the movies that they made. But I think it's interesting to think about what could have been if we were introduced to these stories by the people who wrote them, or we were taught about these stories by the people who wrote them and what the stories really told and what they really said back then.
I think at the end of the day, most of these stories just aren't appropriate for children, so we should have never really been introduced to them as children. And maybe at the beginning of the movie it did say something about where these stories were, or where the concept of these stories were made. Like, so I feel like if it had something like that at the beginning, it would have been nice for us to know and just be more widely talked about. Maybe it did and I've just never noticed. That's totally fair because I don't pay attention at all. But I really hope it does, because I feel like these people, Perel, you were talking about, and the Grimm brothers, they really put a lot of effort and a lot of their lives into making sure that they preserve the history and the traditions of this folklore, right?
Yeah,
and make
exactly.
it into fairy tales. So on that note, I'm actually talking about the Grimm brothers more specifically. The Grimm brothers are probably the second most well-known, or I would say probably the most well-known folklore publishers. So in 1812, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm published a collection of folklore tales from Germany in The Kinder and the Hausmärchen, which I'm probably saying wrong, but that is the German pronunciation, and it's better known in English as the Grimm's fairy tales. So this collection of fairy tales would go on to become arguably the most famous fairy tales still told today, and still the earliest scientific collection of fairy tales ever published. However, the ones we know and love today are vastly different from the originals published by the Grimm brothers. Referred often to the brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm were real brothers from a family of 7. Jacob, the eldest brother, was forced to take care of his 4 siblings at the age of 23 when both his mother and father passed away. Despite this difficult time, he and his brother Wilhelm were still able to attend university and eventually become professors and also librarians, which I guess was a profession that went hand in hand back then.
Probably.
Mm-hmm. So it was while working in the library that they found their love of folklore, and although they initially went into law and wanting to work in the legal system, they decided to switch and follow this passion for folklore. So with this, they began collecting folk songs and poems and any stories that they heard. In 1808, Clemens Brentano, a friend of the brothers, asked if they could collect some folk tales for his book that he was writing. The brothers ended up sending him over 50 stories, but unfortunately they were all destroyed, and Clemens Brentano eventually gave up on writing his book. Luckily, the brothers had saved the copies of the stories, and a few years later, from encouragement of a close friend, they decided to continue to collect folklore tales and publish their first edition of the Kinder and the Hausmärchen.
And that's the German...
The Hausmärchen.
The German translation. I think you're killing it.
Yeah, I am. I know it. I can feel it off the tongue. It sounds right. So they published it first in 1812 with 86 tales, and followed it by another edition in 1815 with 70 more tales.
Was it a big printed book with like full of these tales, like really large and in charge book?
Yes.
Holy moly.
Yeah. Some of them were a lot bigger than others, and they were obviously written in a different format than we would want to read them today. The stories would have footnotes as stories, as kind of like, I guess maybe a secondary story, because at one point when they were talking about replacing certain stories, they said some stories would just become footnotes, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's in like the fairy tale book fashion that we would picture it today.
Because I imagined this, pulling this big book off the shelf and dusting it off, blowing off the dust, and opening it up, and on the sides it's gold leaf flecked pages, and it's, all these really cool illustrations, but also really creepy and dark. But I'm assuming that's probably not. That seems a little bit...
No, that's right.
That's right.
No,
I'm
that's
right.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
that's
oftentimes
exactly what it is.
Right.
Yes. With me, you are.
Yes.
We're both right. So, over the next 40 years, the brothers published 7 editions of the folklore book, which I guess is not a folklore book, technically.
Technically, it's a fairy tale book.
Fairy tale book. And it grew to be the second most popular book in all of Germany, second to... What do you think the most popular book in Germany was?
The Bible?
Yeah. So it was second to the Bible, so it was right up there. The brothers wrote this book to preserve the history of their local stories. Most stories were passed down orally, and for the fear of them being forgotten, the brothers put them into print. Obviously, a few were made in print, as Asha said, from Perel, but most of them were oral. Because of the nature of the stories, as these publications came out, more and more people sent in their own family folklore stories, along with their own versions of the existing stories in the book. By the 7th edition, many stories were vastly different from the originals, as the brothers had not only honed the stories to be more widely received, but also added embellishments along the way. Many stories were also either replaced by better ones, or simply because they were too cruel, grotesque, or not of German descent. So if they found that a folklore story or fairy tale resembled another region a little bit too much, or it was found out that it was kind of from a different region, they would replace it with one that was more German-based.
They were technically being censored, in a way?
No. It was just their preference. They wanted it to be a German folklore book or fairy tale book. So today we're familiar with many of these stories, first published, such as Rumpelstiltskin, Hansel and Gretel, Cinderella, and Little Red Riding Hood. However, I wanted to summarize a less well-known fairy tale for us today called The Goose Girl, which is kind of funny that you mentioned Mother Goose earlier, because they're written so long ago. They're written with a different form of English, so some of it was a little bit more difficult to understand. So I've kind of put it into like layman's terms and a little bit summarized it, and then the end bit seemed pretty good, so the last of it is mostly just the story. So the story begins with a queen whose husband, the king, had passed years prior. They had a beautiful daughter, a princess, who was promised to marry another king's son from a far-off land. As the queen prepared the princess to set off and travel to this faraway land to marry the prince, she gave the princess many jewels and treasures as a dowry: a waiting woman to tend to the princess and help her in her new kingdom, and the princess's horse, Falada. Falada was no ordinary horse, but a horse who could speak. Finally, before saying goodbye, the queen cut her finger and bled 3 drops of blood onto a handkerchief before giving it to the princess and telling her to take care of it, and it would take care of her. As the princess and the waiting woman began their journey, the princess became thirsty and asked the waiting woman to fetch her some water from the brook nearby. The waiting woman refused and said that the princess would need to kneel at the brook herself. The princess continued until she became so thirsty she dismounted and kneeled at the brook for water. "Oh dear," said the poor princess, and the 3 drops of water heard her, and said, "If your mother knew of this, it would break her heart." But the princess answered nothing and quietly mounted her horse again. So they rode on some miles farther. The day was warm, the sun shone hot, and the princess grew thirsty once more. And when they came to a water cross, she called it again to the waiting woman and said, "Get down and give me a drink out of my golden cup," for she had forgotten all that had gone on before. But the waiting woman said, "If you want a drink, you may get it yourself. I am not going to be your slave." So as her thirst was so great, the princess had to get off her horse and had to stoop towards the running water to drink. And as she stooped, she wept and said, "Oh dear." And 3 drops of blood heard her and answered, "If your mother knew of this, it would break her heart." And as she drank, the napkin on which were the 3 drops of blood fell out of her bosom and floated down the stream, and in her distress she never noticed it. Not so the waiting woman, who rejoiced because she should have the power over the princess, who now had lost the 3 drops of blood and had become weak and unable to defend herself. And as the princess went to mount Falada again, the waiting woman cried, "Falada belongs to me, and this jade to you." The waiting woman then made the princess switch clothes with her, mount the lesser horse, and said if the princess said anything that the waiting woman would kill her. Falada saw everything.
That's scary.
The talking horse. As they entered the new kingdom, the waiting woman presented herself as the fake bride, and the princess as nothing more than a slave. However, the princess's composure and beauty caught the eye of the king. She was given the job of helping a young man, Conrad, who took care of geese. As time passed, the fake bride asked the prince to kill Falada, the horse, because the horse was troublesome. However, it was just because she was scared he would tell the king the truth of who she really was. The princess found out and bribed a man in town to keep Falada's head and nail it to the front gates, so that she could see him every day on her walk through town with the geese. Early the next morning, she and Conrad drove their geese through the gate. She said as she went by, "Oh, Falada, dost thou hang there?" And the head answered, "Princess, dost thou mean meanly fair? By if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain. But she went on through the town, driving her geese to the field. And when they came into the meadows, she sat down and undid her hair, which was all of gold. And when Conrad saw how lovely it glistened, he wanted to pull a few hairs for himself. And as she said, "O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, make him run after it as it flies, while I with my gold hair will play and twist it up, it's seemingly wise." Thereafter came a strong wind, strong enough to blow Conrad's hat far away over the fields, and he had to run after it. And by the time he came back, she had put her hair up with combs and pins, and he could not get any of it to pull out. And he was sulky and would not speak to her, so they looked after the geese until the evening came, and then they went home. The next morning, as they passed under the dark gateway, the princess said, "O Falada, dost thou hang there?" And Falada answered, "Princess, dost thou meanly fare? But if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain." When they reached the fields, she sat down and began to comb out her hair. Then Conrad came up and wanted to seize upon some of it, and she cried, "O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, make him run after it as it flies, while I with my golden hair will play and do it up in seemingly wise." When the wind came and blew Conrad's hat very far away, so that he had to run after it, and when he came back again, her hair was up. And after they had got home, Conrad went to the old king and said, "I will tend the geese no longer with that girl." "Why not?" asked the old king. "Because she vexes me the whole day," answered Conrad. Then the old king ordered him to tell him how it was. "Every morning," said Conrad, "as we pass under the dark gateway with the geese, there is an old horse's head hanging on the wall, and she says to it, 'O Falada, dost thou hang there?' And the head answers, 'Princess, dost thou so meanly fare? But if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain.'" And besides this, Conrad related all that had happened in the fields, and how he was obliged to run after his hat. The old king told him to go drive the geese next morning as usual, and he himself, behind the gate, listened how the maiden spoke to Falada. And then he followed them into the fields and hid himself behind a bush. And he watched the goose boy and the goose girl tend the geese. And after a while he saw the girl make her hair all loose, and how it gleamed and shone. Soon she said, "O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, and make him follow as it flies, while I with my golden hair will play and bind it up in seemingly wise." Then there came a gust of wind, and away went Conrad's hat, and he after it, while the maiden combed and bound up her hair, and the old king saw all that went on. At last he went unnoticed away, and when the goose girl came back in the evening, he sent for her, and asked for the reason of her doing all this. "That I dare not tell you," she answered, "nor I can tell any man of my woe, for when I was in danger of my life I swore an oath not to reveal it." And he pressed her sore, and left her no peace, but he could get nothing out of her. At last he said, "If you will not tell me, tell it to the iron oven," and went away. Then she crept into the iron oven and began to weep, and to lament. At last she opened her heart and said, "Here I sit forsaken all of the world, and I am a king's daughter, and a wicked waiting woman forced me to give up my royal garments and my place at the bridegroom's side, and I am made a goose girl, and I have to do mean service, and if my mother knew, it would break her heart." Now the old king was standing outside by the oven door listening, and he heard all she said, and he called to her and told her to come out of the oven. And he caused royal clothing to be put upon her, and it was a marvel to see how beautiful she really was. The old king then called his son and proved to him that he had had the wrong bride. The prince was glad at heart when he saw her beauty and gentleness, and a great feast was made ready, and all the court people and good friends were bidden to it. The bridegroom sat in the midst, with the princess on one side and the waiting woman on the other. And the false bride did not know the true one, because she was dazzled with her glittering braveries. When all the company had eaten and drunk, the old king gave the waiting woman a question to answer, telling the whole story and ending by asking, "Now, what doom does such a one deserve? No better than this, answered the false bride, that she be put naked into a cask, studded with sharp nails, and be dragged along it by 2 white horses from street to street until she is dead. Thou hast spoken thy own doom, said the king. As thou hast said, so shall be done. And when the sentence was fulfilled, the prince married the true bride, and ever after they ruled over their kingdom in peace and blessedness.
Whoa.
Yeah. So just like a really light punishment to be put into a cask that has nails shoved through it and dragged through the street by 2 horses.
Wow.
And that's how the waiting woman was killed.
What a lovely story to tell your children before they go to sleep.
Right? I thought so. I at first thought that the princess was going to fall in love with Conrad.
Yeah.
I was like, perfect. That sounds great. But nope. Nope.
Wow.
She ended up with the king still. And the waiting woman died. Brutally. Yeah. Anyways. So as you can see, this story, although a semi-nice ending, is quite dark. And the same goes for many stories, such as Cinderella. The story is similar, however, there are a few differences, such as the staircase where she loses her slipper. It actually got stuck because she had ran away one night, so the next night, the prince covered up the staircase in tar.
So she wouldn't run away.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't get far.
So her foot got stuck.
They definitely left that out from the movie.
Yeah. And also, she doesn't have fairy godmothers or anything like that. Her mother's grave site has a tree, and when she shakes the tree, she can ask for things. So that's how she gets the pretty ball gowns and stuff like that. And instead of the mice to help her, because that's what Cinderella has, she has mice, she has pigeons to help her.
Oh.
And these pigeons help her each night sort the peas and the lentils from good to bad, so that she can go to the tree, shake it, ask for a gown, and then go to the ball. And then come home. And the sisters, when the prince comes around looking for the shoe, or the foot that the shoe fits into, the classic story, the first sister goes into her room, she cuts off a chunk of her heel, and then goes with the prince. And he's like, amazing, this is my bride, this is perfect. They get in the carriage, they're going, and then they're turning into the gates, and 2 pigeons squeak, this is all wrong, this is all wrong, you've got the wrong bride. And then he looks and he sees the blood in her shoe, takes her back, and then he goes, well, is it somebody else? Second sister cuts off her toes, gets in the carriage with this man, same thing happens with the pigeons, this is all wrong, you got the wrong bride, goes back until he finally is like, is there any other woman here? And they're like, well, it couldn't be Cinderella. And of course it is. Fits her feet perfectly. She goes with him. At the wedding, these pigeons sit on the shoulders of the stepsisters as she's going down the aisle, and they poke their eyes out.
So the pigeons poke the sisters' eyes out.
Yeah. So
Awesome.
The sisters are blinded. So, like, all very, like, it's all the exact same.
Oh, totally. The exact same from the movies.
But it's, like, just darker.
Yeah.
Like, but the whole concept is the exact same, which is just crazy. So, not only this, with the, so not only were Disney movies inspired by these creepy fairy tales, in my opinion, but not surprisingly, really, these folk tales also inspired the known horror novelist Stephen King. So he took a lot of inspiration from folklore in general, more specifically for his short stories. However, his very well-known Carrie is actually inspired by Cinderella and Rapunzel.
I had no idea.
Yeah, so the cruel siblings are kind of seen as the high school peers.
Right.
That's kind of how he saw it. Yeah, so that's how he interpreted it. So yeah.
A little bit of an inspiration kick to inspire him to write Carrie.
Yeah.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That's super cool.
And I guess, like, Rapunzel was her being isolated. And it was really cool to kind of read about it because it was talking a lot about feminine power and feminine, like, pushing women down was kind of what he was basing it off of, I guess. Yeah. Or at least the article I read was saying that he based it off of that.
Wow.
But yeah.
How do you feel about the more sinister or darker elements in these classic fairy tales?
I think back then they had a purpose. I think kids back then probably responded better to this. I think it was just a darker time.
They were exposed to a lot darker things back then.
Yeah, and I think you can just see, even in our lifetime, we can see how gentle parenting is a thing.
Yes.
So even how we were parented, and how our parents were parented, is so vastly different than what is allowed to this day. So I can only imagine that it was that much different in the 1800s. So I feel like it makes sense why we would have these fairy tales that don't really resonate with us the same, these like older ones, because even there's been talk of changing old fairy tales that we have like from Disney. I know that they've said that like some of it's not appropriate and they want to change it. And I think fairy tales that are made now in these years are heavily ridiculed if they're inappropriate at all. So I think that it's just kind of time passing, and these actually probably were okay, decently okay for the kids back then.
Yeah.
You know?
I think it served a purpose back then, and it also serves a purpose now. There's morals in these stories that are told in the Disney movies, you know, or the stories that are written now, the fairy tales that are written now by authors that are illustrated. You know, don't go into the woods alone, stranger danger, all those kind of things.
Well, also, they weren't just made up stories for kids at the end of the day. They were stories that were told from one town to the next, from family to family, and they were based in truth at one point. Exactly. Yeah. Embellished to a certain extent, you know. We don't have talking horses. Maybe back then they did. But maybe, you know, this was like a little bit of a, okay, well, don't. I really have no idea what that was saying, that story, I'm not going to lie. Kind of like don't steal, and be a horrible person. Yeah. But, like, at the end of the day, the princess was telling the waiting woman to be her slave and not treating her the best necessarily. So, I mean. So
interesting. I'm glad you chose that story. It was definitely not a story that I had heard of or was going to like go out and read. It's kind of something I feel that's been maybe lost in translation, something that Disney's not going to pick up.
But yeah, nailing the head of a horse corpse.
It's a little bit morbid.
Yeah, just like a little bit, because I thought when she bribed the worker that she was going to save the horse, of course. Nope. Just if you could please display the head for me.
The horse, of course.
Yes.
So, finishing it off, I have a really big question to ask you. Because I know the answer, but I'm interested to hear what your answer is. Which fairy tale do you think would make the best modern day reality TV show?
Oh my goodness. I haven't thought about this at all.
I'll tell you mine.
Okay. Take it away.
Picture, camera, set up like Big Brother.
Okay.
But it's Snow White in her house with all the dwarves. And it's a little bit of bickering fights of her and having all of these little men inside of her house. And maybe throw in a couple challenges here and there. Like who can pick the most berries, or, you know.
Who can clean the fastest. Who can make the best stew.
Yeah. But there's so many different personalities at play, which I think makes for great television, don't you think?
Well, also, all shoved into one tiny home.
Yeah, and on top of that, it could be like a Big Brother experience, but also a tiny home experience. Like, MTV, welcome to my tiny home. I live in the tiny home with all these dwarves.
With 8 people.
One tall woman, bunch of tiny men. How does it work?
My dream.
Tune in next week to figure it out.
I mean, I feel like Cinderella would be good too, though, because, you know, in the starting days when she's with her evil stepsisters, I feel like that can be fun. Like, in a lighter way.
When they're kind of roasting her and
bullying her.
Treating her like shit, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's not necessarily, like, fun, but...
It makes for good television.
Yeah, it's drama.
And that's what they want.
The evil stepmom is kind of like Real Housewives vibes.
Exactly.
Yeah. I feel like she would definitely give those vibes. And then, like, spoiled children.
Exactly.
And then we have the one down-to-earth girl that we actually like and we root for.
Yeah. We have, like, hashtag team so-and-so.
Team Ella.
Team Ella, exactly. Well, that was our talk on fairy tales and folklore, I feel like I've learned a little bit more about folklore and fairy tale than I had known previously. It's such a fun topic to talk about because, you know, we grew up with all this kind of stuff and now we don't really partake in the discussion of fairy tales in our everyday life. So
I mean, it makes me want to go find this book or this like original book, and I mean, I would never be able to find one, but it makes me want to go look at it and read the original stories, even from the first edition, because the ones I'm reading I don't think are from the first edition. I think they're from the 7th, and so they've been, you know, made a little tiny bit better. I'd really love to dive into more stories.
Wouldn't you like to know?
I would.
I would. You should too.
You should. But when they reached the field, she sat down.
She went to the field, put her pants down, and took a big shit.